this took much longer. Has the issue of stopping time been discussed? You know, Mr. Salega?
Not yet, sir.
Okay, so maybe during the lunch it could be discussed so that when we return after lunch I can be told, because we have lost quite some time. It would be good if the President is able to go beyond 4 o'clock. But I think also the evidence leaders maybe can arrange themselves in such a way that when one finishes and another one must take over, we can do that without a break, because the breaks seem to take longer than we would like. So if maybe the evidence leaders can work on that if possible, so that as one leaves the podium, another can come in without us needing to take a break if possible. Okay, all right.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, Mr. Salega is going to question you on ESCOM-related matters.
Indeed, sir. Thank you. Pleased to meet you, Mr. President. Chair, just housekeeping quickly. The affidavit of Mr. President related, the second affidavit relating to the matters we are about to traverse, maybe should be admitted as an exhibit. That affidavit is in bundle 3, Mr. President. I would ask you to go to page 6 of that bundle 3. And we're using the black pagination at the top left-hand corner. So on page 6 is you find the first, it's a cover page with the index, and between the trend lines is written a statement by the President of the Republic of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. You see that, Mr. President?
I've got the statement, yes. It actually starts at page 8. It is just the index that comes before that.
Yes. And then it goes all the way to page 143. And on page 143, it's a signature above your name. Do you confirm that to be your signature, Mr. President?
Yes, it is.
And then the affidavit is commissioned. I see there's no handwriting of the date, but the stamp date is 24 May 2021. Confirm that to be the date when you signed your statement?
Yes,
Mr. President. And do you confirm then the contents of your affidavit is true and correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
And I think that was true. So yes. Yes.
Thank you. Chairperson, may I then beg leave to have, it's actually an affidavit, I know it's titled a statement. The affidavit of Mr. President, starting from page 8 of the bundle to page 143, together with the annexures thereto, admitted as exhibit BBB 3.1.
The affidavit of President Cyril Ramaphosa that starts at page 8 of bundle 3 is admitted as an exhibit and will be marked as exhibit BBB 3.4.
Thank you.
You said 3.4, not 3.1?
3.1.
3.1.
Yes.
Okay. Correction, 3.1. Okay. You may continue.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, just by way of introduction and for the benefit of Mr. President. Mr. President, the intention was to lead your evidence in respect of 4 items in relation to ESCOM. One is the war room and the establishment of the war room, the purpose for the war room, and in relation to that is the allegations you have addressed in regard to Mr. Brian Molefe. The second issue it relates to the secondment of Mr. Molefe and Mr. Arnold Singh to ESCOM and the role that would have been played by the ANC Deployment Committee. The third issue, which you have also touched on, are the allegations of Mr. Koko. And then, lastly, also connected to Mr. Koko and Mr. Molefe, is the allegation they make about load shedding. Essentially that it was when you got appointed that load shedding came back in the country. So let's start with the war room. And I'll keep my eye on the time. Please ourselves. I know that you do deal with the war room in your affidavit, Mr. President, but maybe you could explain to the chairperson, as I have also seen that you endeavor to distinguish between the war room, the technical war room on the one hand, and the IMC on the other, and it tries to clear the confusion you say existed between the two and the role that you played in relation to the two. You could just, in summary, deal with that.
Okay. Well, the IMC was set up, really. And IMC is an interministerial body, which I, as Deputy President, was then delegated to lead. It largely dealt with more broader strategic issues, but also had to deal with the challenges that ESCOM was going through at a very broad strategic level. The war room itself, called it the technical war room, which was largely overseen by deputy ministers and my then chief of staff, Mr. Busani Ngaweni, was the key coordinator, and it was housed at the union buildings. It was composed of your more technically inclined people who did the work, and it also had people from ESCOM itself. And it got involved in the more operational issues, which I, as an oversight person, did not get involved in. And all I ever really got were reports on an ongoing basis. And for the most part, they also dealt with what we had dubbed as the 5-point plan. The 5-point plan that dealt with issues of ensuring, and I would call it now in the statement, that ensured issues of how best we could increase the capacity of ESCOM and be able to get more generation that would also include the conversion of some of the power stations to gas, as we were already seeing the challenge that ESCOM was having in relation to the breakage of a number of power stations due to lack of maintenance, but it also had to deal with the maintenance program, how that maintenance program would need be overseen. So that is the type of work that the technical war room did. So the distinction between the two was the IMC more strategic matters, of broad nature, and the technical war room of the real technical issues that needed to be dealt with. That's the extent to which those two entities were.
Yeah. I listened during your opening speech, Mr. President, that you described yourself as the chairperson of the IMC, but that you were not the chairperson of the technical war room. So, what was your role in relation, if at all, in relation to the technical war room? Now, I beg your pardon, I'm asking that question because you would have heard Mr. Koko, Mr. Molefe have alleged that you were the chairperson of the war room. Maybe you could explain that position.
Well, I think there's a confusion, and that's why in my opening statement I sought to verify. There would be, for those who were possibly not within the bowels of government at, say, the union buildings level or cabinet level, that confusion could be there. I did play an oversight role also in the war room as I periodically received the reports, and the fact that my chief of staff at the time, Mr. Ngaweni, was intricately involved in the technical war room meant that from an oversight point of view, the Deputy President, yes, sought to oversee the work, but my real key role was that of chairing the IMC. That was the key role.
Yes. Well, while we are there, let me dispose of this allegation, which was that, should I assist you with the page?
No, that's fine. Yes. Yeah.
Should I assist you with the page number?
You can.
That's on page, it starts on page 57.
Yes.
Of the affidavit.
Indeed.
Yes.
Are you referring to page 57 of the affidavit or page 57 of the bundle?
Okay. 57 of the bundle.
Which is the black numbers on the top left.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. President, then I wanted to dispose of this issue while we are there, which is the allegation that when you played the role that you played in relation to the technical war room, as given your either at the time previous connection with Glencore, with OCH, that you didn't allow for a cooling off period so that there can be any potentiality of conflict on your part be dissipated. And I will do this in relation to the allegations, so I'll put them to you, and you can address them to the chairperson.
Well, Chairperson, I have heard of this cooling off period process. And it's an interesting notion. I did not appoint myself. I was appointed by the President, a President to whom I had disclosed all my sort of like business dealings of the past. A President who, on assuming office, I informed, as it is expected in terms of the Code of Ethics, my interests, and I laid them all out. And my interests, which at the time involved my past interest in Shanduka, which through its Shanduka Resources had a shareholding in Optimum Holdings. And I had disclosed that I was disposing of all those interests, and even asked for extended time to be able to do so, which was granted. And I had also resigned from the board, as I said in my initial opening statement. So as far as I was concerned, I had distanced myself, and the President was fully aware of all these, and the repository of all this is the Director General, who received all these disclosures, who would have, as the Director General is expected, made sure that all the protocols and all the regulations are properly observed. So all that was declared, was known, and as I was appointed, I had no further dealings with the coal business, if I may say so. But then again, my dealings in those two structures never revolved around issues of procurement, coal contracts, and all that. And even if by some imagination they could have, I would have recused myself immediately, because conflict of interest in my world is something that either needs to be declared or needs to be avoided. And in this regard, it had been declared, and I had completely walked away and moved away from such. So the cooling off period is an interesting notion. It's not generally, it's not been inculcated into our processes. But for me, the safeguard was having declared and having distanced myself, and having been appointed by someone who knew or should have known, there were enough safeguards in that regard. So I would say the allegation, in my view, falls flat because of the principles that I uphold, as well as the various actions that I had taken of resigning, of disposing, and of ensuring that I do not get involved in procurement issues.
Yes. Along with that, Mr. President, is the allegation that Glencoe / OCH, which is Optimum Coal Holdings, failed to do a due diligence at the time of acquisition of OCM. And that failure was deliberately made because Glencoe OCH knew that they could rely on your political, or on their connection they had with you as a political heavyweight to muscle Eskom into increasing the coal price once they have acquired OCM. And I'm also going to give you a chance to respond to that allegation. It's made both by Mr. Koko and by Mr. Brian Molefe. And this, according to them, on the one hand, is their reliance on your connection with them, and on the other hand, is you being placed in a position where you would be able to influence decision-making within ESCOM. What do you say to that allegation?
Very interesting. When I was chair of Shanduka, we decided to set up an entity called Shanduka Resources, and through that we partnered Glencore and ourselves sought to form a consortium that would acquire some resources assets. And one of those was a coal entity. It was listed and acquired some of the shares initially through the listed counter, and thereafter felt that we should make an approach to acquire the entire shareholding. And this is acquiring shares of a holding company, which holding company would have a number of subsidiaries.
Oh, I think it's back, Mr. President.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay.
So when you acquire shares of a listed entity, which may have a number of subsidiaries, what you normally do is to rely on published information, which is available to everyone. And you then buy the shares, and that's precisely how it happened. There was therefore no real need to go and do a due diligence on each of the subsidiaries, because you were acquiring an entity that's listed and you're acquiring the shares. You were not necessarily buying the assets directly. And in the case of Optimum Holdings and Optimum Mine, that's the differentiation. Optimum Mine is the subsidiary, and Optimum Holdings is the listed entity. And then an offer had to be made to the board, to the shareholders, and it was for the acquisition of the shares. And whatever you acquire the holding company, you would also consequentially be acquiring the subsidiaries, which could in some cases be many, but you rely on the published information that's available to everyone. So there was therefore no need for a due diligence because you are acquiring shares. As regards thinking that, partnering with Glencore was, they were relying on my political connections. I was in business, I was not in government, and to the extent that if they ever thought so, which they didn't, as far as I'm concerned, it was just purely a business transaction, to the extent that they could have relied on me or indeed anyone else for political connections. In my case, they would have been mistaken, because much as one would have wanted to get into the coal business, it had to be a business that is run in accordance with rules and without bringing undue influence on anyone to act against the interests of, in my case, I would say a publicly owned entity, whose interests I would always want to advance. So I refute and I deny the notion that I could have been used as a politically connected person, and I reject that outrightly.
Yes. Let me also put this statement, which, well, an allegation rather made by Mr. Ramaphosa as well, to you, Mr. President, so that you could also address it in the same context. So he says, for instance, when he arrived at ESCOM, talking of the war room, he says a de facto board of the company had been established outside of the company in the form of a war room in the presidency. Management had to report to the war room. Then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa chaired it. This effectively made him the de facto chairperson of ESCOM and put him in a powerful position to pursue Lenko's agenda at ESCOM. Were you de facto the chairperson of ESCOM?
No. I mean, even with anybody's imagination, I could never have been ESCOM's chairperson. I was deputy president, and in that role, we were dealing with the challenges that ESCOM was facing, and I could never be that blasé as to want to advance the interests of one company that everyone could have known that I was associated with in the past, much as I had already disposed of my interest. So no, I deny I was chairman of ESCOM. Even the notion of being chairman of ESCOM is quite bizarre, because how does the deputy president become the chairman of an entity like ESCOM? It would violate every corporate governance rule. At best, what the technical war room was doing was to address the challenges that ESCOM was facing at the time, and which were clearly delineated, a task which I had been asked to undertake by none other than the President of the Republic. Thank you.
Yes, I should emphasize, Mr. President, that he underscores his allegation by saying de facto and not de jure.
Yes.
So he doesn't say legally you were, but he says factually you were. So essentially you were the chairman of the board. But I think you have addressed the
I have
question.
addressed it, yes.
Now those are the conflicts alleged in regard to yourself relative to the war room. But there's an apparent conflict now in relation, or contradiction in relation to the former president. And let's see how you comment on that one, because the IMC and the war room, as I read from your affidavit, were either one or two of them, or both of them, were established, amongst other things, to address the issue of electricity crisis in the country.
To address, sorry?
Electricity crisis in the country.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Cabinet had set up the structures for that purpose. But evidence has been laid before the Commission to the effect that during March 2015, because this Cabinet establishment is December 2014, but during March 2015, the then President, Mr. Jacob Zuma, is involved in a meeting in Durban at his official residence, amongst others with Ms. Dudu Myeni, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, who was the chairperson of the ESCOM board at the time. And this is one of the meetings in which a plan is conceived or maybe hatched to establish an inquiry within ESCOM and suspend the executives. This inquiry is also, amongst others, meant to address or look into the electricity crisis in ESCOM. Were you aware of what I've said now? The meetings the former president would have had in Durban, where Ms. Dudu Myeni was present, Mr. Zola Tsotsi was present, and others, to discuss this very issue of the inquiry.
Well, maybe we should add, Mr. Selega, that in that meeting, another issue that was discussed was discussed or planned was the suspension of a number of executives at ESCOM. And you would obviously know that at some stage they were suspended and ultimately left ESCOM. So when you comment on the question, just bear in mind that this is a meeting where the president, to whom you were deputy, met with certain people in his official residence in Durban. The date was the 8th of March, 2015. And this was discussed. A number of witnesses who were present have given evidence in regard to this. Of those witnesses, only Ms. Myeni denies that the president took part in the meeting, but I think all the other witnesses say that he took part.
No, I was not aware of this meeting. Like everyone else, I got to know about the suspension of those executives, some of whom we interfaced with at the IMC, and they were suspended and they were gone. And I was not aware of the meeting and the discussions and the decision.
Mm.
Would it be fair to say you would have expected to have been informed if the then president was part of discussions that would see to the suspension of executives at ESCOM in the light of your role in regard to ESCOM?
Yes, I was surprised that I was not brought into the loop, as it were, or informed. So it just happened, and yes.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Selega.
Thank you. So I understand, Mr. President, you to be saying to the chairperson, you had no prior knowledge of the suspensions.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
After they had happened, I'm sorry, Mr. Selega, after they had happened, the suspensions, Mr. President, and maybe the removal of these executives, did the then president ever discuss with you what role
I understand, Mr. President,
may have played in what he
you
had
to be
known
saying to
about
the
it?
chairperson, you...
Or did that never happen?
It never really was a direct type of discussion.
Okay.
So I would not be able to...
Yes. Okay, all right.
so.
Mr. Selega.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I recall reading your answers to the National Assembly back in 2015, I think 18 March 2015, where your tone was rather positive about this inquiry we're talking and the suspension of the executives. you do mention it in your answer to the National Assembly. This is on the 18th of March, 7 days after the suspensions had been effected. Had you at that time decided in your mind that this was a good thing for Eskom?
The answering questions in the National Assembly, the suspensions would have happened, and that was fait accompli. It had happened, and we had to move on and move ahead. So I'm not so sure whether one expressed it in a positive light or not, because the impression one got was that they were doing their work, and they were, some of them were quite proficient in what they were doing, but one was dealing with a fait accompli, and so one, in answering questions, had to say, yes, this has happened, and we move on, and we try to address the challenges that Eskom is having. So I would not specifically be able to say, you know, am I excited? Am I happy about all this? No, it has happened, and we move on.
Well, it might be helpful, Mr. Selaga, if you have got the relevant extract at hand,
Yes, Chair.
to read that to the President so that you refresh his memory.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Mr. President, that is in Bundle 5. I have given it to the President.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I think.
Page 123. Page 123.
I'm getting there.
Well, I see the page numbers are the same, whether the red or the black.
Indeed, I can see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very small print.
Very small
very
print.
small. Did you say, Mr. Selaga, this was on the 18th of March 2015?
Correct, Chair.
The suspensions happened on the 11th of March.
That's right.
So this would have been 7 days later.
Correct, Chair.
Okay, all right.
This is fresh after the suspension. Paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, Mr. President, where you respond to a question, I think of Mr. Singh.
Yes.
Yeah. He's specifically talking about these issues. And your response is, yes, we can say, and he's asking whether will there be light at the end of the tunnel. You say, yes, we can say there will be light at the end of the tunnel, as well as we all know. Eskom faces challenges, but these challenges are being addressed. They are being addressed notwithstanding the fact that the 4 executives have been put on leave of absence for 3 months. It is a leave of absence just for 3 months. An inquiry takes off, and as it happens, it will be done within 3 months, and thereafter, much clearer executive future will be determined. Well, it goes on. I believe that the problem at the leadership level will be addressed, and so on. Yeah.
Well, there's a prior paragraph which I thought you might have wanted to refer to, where Mr. Singh says, Mr. Chairman, that we know, Honorable Deputy President, that you've been handed the poisoned chalice. And the evidence leader is handing me another poisoned chalice. No, I mean, yes, now that you refer me to this, I recollect that they were placed on leave so that the inquiry could happen. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that I was not, made privy of the decision to have them either suspended or placed on leave. But it is also as I responded to it here, because I was dealing with a factual situation, fait accompli, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was Mr. President aware, were you aware that Mr. Matuna, the chief executive, had only been there for about 5 months?
Yes.
You were aware of that?
I was aware of it.
May I ask you, Mr. President, in regard to the election you chose, you mentioned the options you had in your opening speech, which is also dealt with in your affidavit. And the last option, or the option you ultimately chose, was to stay.
Yes.
Stay within. And I think try to change things from within.
Yes.
And to the extent, I also get a sense that the intention was offer some resistance. Tell me if I'm correct in that assessment. Offer some resistance to some of activities that are either relating to state capture or corruption. Will that be correct?
Yes, with a view to changing things, yes.
Now, when these things were happening, I want to ask you, pursuant to that election you made, did you consider that you could do anything to find out what's happening? Why are these executives suspended? Why does ESCOM need to have an inquiry? And into what? Because the war room is here, the IMC for energy is also here. I oversee the turnaround of all these SOEs, the strategy, exactly what is going on. Did you, pursuant to that election, see it fit to approach matters in that way?
Within the context of everything else that was happening, which context would also lead me to the decision that I then took to go to President Zuma and say, I think we should close the war room, because as these suspensions happened, I suddenly realized that there were just too many initiatives that were all happening at the same time. We had the war room on one side, the IMC on one side. We had what President Zuma was doing on one side.
We had the board
on one side and all that. To deal with the issue that you raise as a concern, for me, was to say, let's close this war room. Let's have one entry point into ESCOM. Let us even go a little further. Having closed the war room, let the board and the executive also be in charge. And I'm not so sure now of the sequencing, but one of the things I then did when I saw President Zuma was to say, let us appoint Brian Molefe as the CEO of ESCOM, close the war room. And he has proven himself to be quite an effective CEO. And let's give him the responsibility of doing so. Then there will be one entry point, and all of us would then stop what we were trying to do with regard to ESCOM, because it leads to confusion. So that was my take, and the chronology could be synchronized with what I've just said, but that's precisely the view that I took, because I was getting frustrated as well, because this action had now been taken, and there was to be an investigation and so on, and I felt we're messing things up. We're just having too many entry points. Let's have one. and that would be the CEO and the board, and they would be able to address all the challenges.
Do you have any suspicions at that stage in the light of these suspensions and an inquiry being suggested for ESCOM without you having any prior knowledge? Did you have any suspicions that there must be something untoward here? How can, being deputy president and having been given this assignment to try and oversee the turnaround strategy for ESCOM, not be consulted beforehand to say 4 executives would be suspended all at the same time?
Yeah.
They've been inquiring into the affairs of ESCOM. I don't know anything. Did this give rise to any suspicion on your part to say maybe there's something untoward going on here, or not really?
It was more frustration, more exasperation and frustration that I had and my immediate staff also had. So that was the issue. And by suspicion, if you think that, did we think that there was something untoward that was of a dark nature? Not at the time. It was just the frustration.
Okay, Mr. Slager.
And Mr. President, in addition to that, I mean, the response to the National Assembly emphasizes that this is a leave, well, you chose the words leave of absence for 3 months. It is leave of absence just for 3 months as the inquiry takes off. And I'm sure you became aware that 3 of them never came back to ESCOM. You did become aware of that fact.
Yes, I did become aware that 3 of them never came back.
Yeah. I told you during the break that ESCOM matters are difficult. They are very complex and intriguing. So if it's difficult to answer some of the questions, it's because they're difficult.
Indeed.
It is. Because the next question is, when you became aware that they didn't come back, I go back to the chairperson's question. Did that bother you? Did that trouble you? If you're not troubled on their suspension, were you troubled or not when you learned that these 3 have been negotiated out of ESCOM?
Yes, I was troubled, and I was not even part of that process of negotiating them out. I recall just the one person who impressed me greatly was the CFO. I later heard that she had moved to another company.
That was Ms. Molefe, I think.
That's Ms. Molefe, yeah. I then had a desire to talk to her, but we never got the chance to sit and chat, and up till today. So I was never part of that whole process of getting them out of the system.
Well, you might not, Mr. President, be hearing all the evidence that comes from this commission. Obviously, nobody would hear everything except myself. Because even the evidence leaders change, so I'm the only one who doesn't change.
Of course, it's your job. I have mine.
It's my job. You might not have had this evidence that was given to this commission. One, that at the Durban meeting that Mr. Selegari told you about, where President Zuma met with certain people and they were Mr. Tumieni, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, Mr. Linnell, who was a consultant at SAA, a consultant for Ms. Tumieni, and I think one or two other people. The number of executives that were discussed who would be suspended were 3. And they did not include the financial director, the CFO. That was on the 8th of March. And the evidence that I had is that on the 10th of March, certain ESCOM employees, in particular Ms. Daniels and Mr. Masango, had a meeting at Melrose Arch with Mr. Koko and Mr. Salim Essa. And that at that meeting, that is now 1 day before the day when the board decided to suspend them, the executives. It was at that meeting where they discovered, or they were told, that 4 executives would be suspended. And one of them was the financial director, who had been added. Prior to that, she had not featured. And the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Lynn Brown, was asked to address the board on the 11th of March. That is the morning when the decision was taken to suspend. And she was the first person who introduced into the board the 4th person, namely the financial director, as one of the people who should be suspended. Prior to that, as far as we know from what we have been told, she was not one of those to be suspended. And she was suspended. And the question has arisen, and I've put it to Ms. Lynn Brown, I've put it to other people, is where she got this name from. And the evidence I have is simply that Mr. Salim Essa and Mr. Koko had 4 names and not the 3 names that had been discussed at the Durban meeting. So I'm just mentioning that.
Yeah.
Mr. Salega.
So the capture was quite deep, Mr. President.
All that was unknown to me.
But I'm going to go into what you say was your suggestion, Mr. President, to the former president.
Yes,
for the
indeed.
appointment of Mr. Molefe.
Yes.
But as I do so, let me preface that with this question. What is your comment to the observation that the suspension and ultimate removal of the 3 executives was to pave the way or open a space for the secondment or bringing into ESCOM of people who were sympathetic to the Gupta cause?
Well, I was not alive to that, I must say. Because once they had been placed on leave, I was exasperated and felt that we needed to close all the loopholes and not have too many fingers into ESCOM and have just one entry point, and that for me would have been just the appointment of a CEO. So I must say that I was not alive and aware of the appointment or the bringing in of Gupta-linked people. I was just merely looking at it as a clear situation where you want to bring about efficiency into ESCOM. That's all I was looking at.
So you then approached the then president. That is on page 66 of the bundle, where you find the affidavit. You talk about you approaching the former president, Mr. Zuma, and suggested that Molefe should be appointed as CEO of Eskom. That's page 66, paragraph 131.2. In that paragraph, you talk about Mr. Matona being placed on precautionary suspension, and therefore you went and discussed this with the president, or suggested it to the president. So this would have been in 2015, after the suspensions. I want to ask you this question, Mr. President, and I don't know whether this is a coincidence or not. In again, evidence before the commission, a gentleman from a private company in 2014, Mr. Henk Bester, whose company was in negotiations with Transnet for a contract. He's called to a meeting to meet with Mr. Anod Singh, because in this case, he's complaining about Transnet paying invoices late. And one of the gentlemen who wants to be a subcontractor to their company says, well, why don't you approach Mr. Anod Singh directly? That meeting is ultimately arranged, and it takes place at Melrose Arch. There he meets with Mr. Salim Essa, who seems to be coordinating the meeting. And this one meeting leads to another meeting, and I'm cutting a long story short, leads to another meeting where he's called by Mr. Salim Essa, insisting that Mr. Salim Essa's company should be subcontracted to Mr. Henk Bester's company when they get the deal at Transnet. And in that conversation, Mr. Salim Essa is said to have said to him, we will show you how powerful we are. We have decided that Mr. Brian Molefe is the next boss of Eskom. Wow. The CEO of Eskom. This is in 2014. And he is assured, watch this space, look at the news, it will be reported soon. But then that gets to be reported in 2015. On the 17th of April 2016 by Minister Lynn Brown. So your suggestion must have been a coincidence to the then president. Or were you seeing something no one was seeing, Mr. President?
This is very complex.
It's very complex.
Yes. No, I think it was a coincidence. My approach to President Zuma was a clear proposal on how best we could take or resolve the challenges that Eskom was facing. And for me, it was a choice of Brian Molefe, whom I've come to know over years as being a very effective, truly effective CEO, who I had also worked with in another state-owned enterprise, and we had worked extremely well together. That was Sasria. When I made the suggestion, I had no clue, no even awareness of all these issues that Mr. Sileka is talking about. It was just purely on the basis of what I knew about his capability, and also addressing another problem which I had, which was my own exasperation about not feeling that I'm making headway because of all these entry points into Eskom, and I felt we needed somebody who is an effective CEO who would be able to just virtually grab Eskom by the scruff of its neck and take it forward in the most effective way. That's what it was all about.
Can I find out, Mr. President, whether your discussion with Mr. Zuma on that occasion, when you mentioned Mr. Brian Molefe's name, whether you came up with this name without him having said anything about Mr. Brian Molefe at all? Are you able to remember whether, from your point of view, it was just a name that you came up with? He had not mentioned anything about the name himself.
Yes, he didn't mention a name. I basically approached him that I think we should close this war room. We've got too many entry points into ESCOM. Let's have one person who will run with this process of repositioning ESCOM. And I also wanted to be disengaged from the whole process. And I then felt that Brian Molefe was the name that would be able to do the work. So he didn't come up with a name, I came up with a name and put it to him.
No, that's interesting because Ms. Lynn Brown also testified that she got the name of Brian Molefe from Mr. Zuma. Yeah. And it may well be, therefore, that Mr. Zuma mentioned that name to her because you had suggested the name to him.
It's possible.
It's possible. Of course, that question arose because part of what the commission was looking at is certain people who were appointed to certain positions. Where did this come from? You know, the idea that so-and-so should be in that, entity and should occupy a particular position. Was it coming from people who legitimately could make those suggestions or who had the power to say, let's look at that? Now, with regard to Brian Molefe, apart from what Mr. Selega has mentioned to you, namely that in 2014 already, the evidence that the commission has had is that Mr. Salim Essa had told Mr. Hank Bester that we have already decided that Brian Molefe is going to be the next boss of ESCOM. Of course, at that time, in March 2015, Mr. Brian Molefe was the group CEO of Transnet. Now, before he got appointed to that position, which happened in 2011, in 2010, December, I think December 6 or 7 or 10, December 2010, the New Age, that newspaper that used to belong to the Guptas, had carried an article which said that, in effect, Mr. Brian Molefe was going to be the next group CEO of Transnet. This was at a time when Mr. Molefe was not even an applicant for that position. And later on, he was nominated by a board member, Mr. Sharma of Transnet. And although in terms of the points scored in the interviews, he was number 2. He was the one that was picked and became group CEO. So 2 times, sources connected with the Guptas said in advance where he was going to go. First, he was going to be the group CEO of Transnet, and he did become group CEO of Transnet. Second, they said he was going to be the next boss of ESCOM, and he did become the next boss of ESCOM. So within this context, one asked the question, where was this coming from? So Ms. Lynn Brown says she got the name from Mr. Zuma. You have said that you mentioned the name to Mr. Zuma.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. On my part, it was largely based on
his track record?
Yeah, his record, what I knew about him when he worked in Treasury, then later I went to the PIC, and I had worked with him in Sasria when he was still in Treasury, and that was
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, is it correct that Minister Lynn Brown, now most probably unbeknown to her that you had recommended the name to the former president, that she would have consulted with, amongst others, yourself for the secondment of Mr. Brown Molefe to ESCOM?
I would imagine it did. I don't have a direct recollection of all that. I think within the broad parameters of how we worked, I'm sure it would have happened, but right now I don't have that recollection.
Would then the consideration, suggestion, proposition or consideration for Mr. Molefe to be seconded, would it have followed the process of the ANC Deployment Committee, which is that whoever gets recommended must be a suitable candidate. He must apply and he must meet the requirements. Must be a fit. I think you used the word, it must be a fit for the purpose person.
Yeah.
Did that process get to be followed in this case?
Ordinarily, yes, it would have had to be followed, and now we don't have the minutes of the deployment committee at the time as to be able to have that type of recollection. But ordinarily, that's what would have had to happen, because this is a very big state-owned enterprise that has a huge impact on the economy of the country. So that, to answer your question, yes, that would have had to be followed.
Maybe I should ask this question, which is more general. Would it be fair, Mr. President, to work on the basis that when it came to board members and chairpersons of board members of important SOEs such as Transnet, ESCOM, DENEL, SAA, as well as the CEOs, maybe CFOs as well, I'm not sure, but certainly CEOs, would it be fair to say the question of who would fill those positions and who would be appointed would have gone through the deployment committee of the ANC?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Some did and some did not.
Yes.
Yeah. So
but the expectation would be that it should go through them.
Yeah, the expectations would be yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Let me see, so we can try to bring this to a closure, Mr. President.
Thank God.
Still a long way, Mr. President. There are still about two further evidence leaders.
I know.
Yeah. So that's the track record of Mr. Molefe. He's proposed, you say based on his track record, proposed by yourself, but he doesn't stay long at ESCOM. The announcement is made on the 17th of April 2015 by Minister Lynn Brown, and she says that she has made a decision to second him with immediate effect, which is the reason why I was asking whether did that follow the ANC deployment. He says with immediate effect. And given that this would have been consistent, his secondment would have been consistent with at least your suggestion to the then president. Were you concerned if, when, in November or December 2016, you learned of his resignation from ESCOM?
Well, I think word concerned could be something that may not immediately have entered my...
Maybe what was your reaction to the news?
Well, when I heard that he had resigned, I knew that he was moving elsewhere and that we were going to have another CEO who would be appointed. So concern would not have been a word, is not the word that I would use. And I would say, yes, I noted that this had happened. Yeah.
And were you aware that that happened in the wake of the Public Protector's report?
Yes.
And the allegations that had been made connecting Mr. Molefe to the Guptas in that report?
Indeed.
What was your view in regard to that connection? Did that surprise you? Or shall I use the word again, concern, and you can correct it?
I should say that that surprised me because I had never really connected Mr. Molefe in that way with the Gupta family. I had no inkling or knowledge or even suspicion that there was that linkage and connection. So I noted that, and of course, in the fullness of time, that became a real concern, that here was somebody that one held in high regard who was then entangled with a family that had done what it had done to capture the state, as it were. Yeah.
But there were also...
We are at 1 o'clock, Mr. Seleka.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm mentioning that because...
I will take just 2 minutes of your time.
Okay,
yes.
Okay.
But they were also widely, at this stage, this is 2016, by this time the Guptas had landed at the Air Force, at the military Air Force, quite widespread reports about their connection to the then president. And you were aware of those reports, media reports, Mr. President?
Of course, yeah.
Let me ask you, Mr. President, did you know the Guptas?
I did depose to an affidavit.
Yes.
Right at the beginning when I was asked by the commission to detail, as I guess you asked other people, about their knowledge of the Guptas, their interactions with them. And in that I said, yes, I got to meet them. And I haven't read my affidavit again, but my recollection is I met them, I think for the first time. Let me just say I met them soon after we were elected, after the 53rd conference. And it was at a breakfast, and they were there. So I met them. And I did say in my affidavit that I met them again when they came to the ANC headquarters, the Tuli House. And that is when we sat down to chat. And it was at that stage when we also discussed the landing of the plane at Waterkloof Air Force Base. And when I expressed the view about the real difficulties that they had placed President Zuma in and the government by landing the plane, commercial and private plane at a military air base. So that, and I guess one more time at one of the breakfasts. And I remember one time journalists, or it was just either a member of the public who was in the breakfast. He asked me about, what do I say about the Gupta brothers being friends to President Zuma? And I said, well, they are his friends, and that's as far as I know. That's what I said. Yeah.
Chair, may I propose I stop now?
Yeah.
I'll just consider my notes. I might have 2 or so questions which I can dispose of when we come back, and I'll be brief.
Yeah, okay, no, that's all right. Let's take the lunch adjournment, and we will resume at 2. I just remind all concerned who need to have a discussion about whether we stop at 5 or 4, so to please have that discussion during the lunch break. We adjourn.
Thank you, Chair.